All right, let's dive right into this explainer by completely shattering a pretty common illusion. When we picture coral reefs, we usually imagine these super serene, peaceful underwater gardens, right? Ecosystems built purely on sunlight, the gentle flow of water, and just finding a little bit of space on a rock. But underneath all that tranquil surface, there is actually a fierce, completely invisible war raging every single day. Think about it for a second. If you're an organism that is permanently glued to a rock, how exactly do you defend your turf? How do you expand your territory? Well, the crazy answer is the deployment of invisible, long-range weapons right there under the water. They don't need claws, and they don't even need to touch their enemies to do some really serious damage. Section 1. What is allelopathy? The science of chemical warfare. So the crucial mechanism driving this unseen battlefield is something called allelopathy. It's a truly fascinating form of chemical interference. Instead of physically reaching out and stinging a neighbor, these organisms release these highly specific bioactive compounds directly into the surrounding water. Basically, they can literally battle for reef dominance using chemical signaling instead of physical contact. It's a ruthlessly effective way to shape exactly who gets to survive and thrive on a specific patch of reef. Now, you might be wondering who usually ends up on the receiving end of these chemical attacks. Well, the prime targets are typically soft corals, various types of algae, and other sessile, which just means immobile invertebrates. By continuously pumping these compounds out into the water, the dominant corals heavily influence their entire neighborhood. They're essentially evicting their competitors by making the water around them incredibly toxic and stressful. And when those bioactive molecules actually hit their targets, the results are honestly pretty devastating. We see slowed tissue growth, which means the competitor physically just can't expand. We see hindered larval settlement, so brand new competing corals are entirely blocked from ever attaching to the reef in the first place. And overall, there is a massive increase in stress responses. These are the exact biological damages that reduce the overall fitness of the neighboring organisms, giving the chemical attacker a huge spatial advantage. But it's really vital to keep in mind that this whole underwater war doesn't just happen in a vacuum. The environment plays a massive role. Things like the ambient temperature, nutrient levels in the water, and especially how the water is moving can entirely dictate the strength of an attack. The exact same coral might be relatively peaceful on a Tuesday, but launch a much stronger chemical attack on Wednesday if the surrounding environmental conditions suddenly shift. It is a highly dynamic, constantly changing battlefield. Let's move on to Section 2, Why Chemical Warfare Matters, from Oceans to Living Rooms. Let's zoom out for a second. On a massive, macro level in wild reefs, intense chemical competition can severely suppress overall biodiversity. If one dominant species aggressively excludes its competitors, it drastically reduces the whole reef's resilience, which is especially bad on reefs that are already damaged or disturbed. But on a micro level, this is also a massive headache for aquarium hobbyists. You bring home a beautiful new coral, you drop it in your tank, and suddenly you notice inhibited growth or sudden tissue stress. Quite often, it's those invisible chemical compounds from the existing tank residents that are the actual trigger. And the impacts get drastically worse in a few specific areas. We're talking sheltered coves, deep microhabitats, and home tanks with constrained circulation. Why? Well, it all comes down to dilution, or rather, the lack of it. In these high-risk zones, those chemical compounds just get trapped. They can't be easily diluted by strong water movement, meaning the toxic concentration completely spikes, and the surrounding corals take the full, undiluted hit of the allelopathic attack. Section 3. Spotting the warning signs. Is your reef under attack? Since these chemical weapons are literally invisible, hobbyists and conservationists alike really need to memorize the subtle visual cues. The early warning signs are all about closely observing the victims. You might notice reduced growth on a coral, but only on the side facing a specific neighbor. You might see the actual tissue receding, or just weird, unusual stress patterns. Out in the wild, scientists look for localized dominance or mysterious shifts in coral cover that align perfectly with the presence of known chemical producers. These are the telltale signs that a chemical producer is dominating the local area. But, and this is a big but, you've kind of got to play detective here. Things like disease, parasites, heavy sedimentation, and sudden swings in salinity can mimic allelopathic damage almost perfectly, so you absolutely cannot jump to conclusions. You have to use careful observation and controlled testing before officially blaming the damage on a chemical attack. Which brings us to Section 4, Winning the Chemical War, Defense Protocols. Okay, so how do we actually mitigate this threat? Well, there isn't one single magic antidote, mostly because the specific chemistry varies so wildly from species to species. Following this specific step-by-step defense protocol will severely limit chemical exposure. Step 1. Improve water movement to disperse the compounds. Strong flow is absolutely your best friend here. Step 2. Use high-quality activated carbon. This literally absorbs the dissolved organics right out of the water. But remember, you have to replace it regularly. Step 3. Increase physical separation and use quarantine or staged introduction so your sensitive organisms aren't blasted before the filtration catches up. And finally, Step 4. Maintain stable nutrients. Because a healthy, unstressed coral is just so much better equipped to bounce back from competitive pressure.
I love this quote because our ultimate objective here is actually pretty simple. The goal is not to eliminate competition, but to reduce unintended chemistry-driven imbalances that can undermine biodiversity and recovery. Whether you're a conservation manager planning a field layout for a massive restoration plot, or you're a hobbyist managing a living room tank, you aren't trying to stop nature. We just want to promote natural coexistence and resilience, rather than letting unseen chemical exclusion destroy the entire ecosystem.
Because as our oceans face these accelerating disturbances from literally every direction, managing this invisible layer of chemical interactions is quickly becoming just as crucial as managing light and water quality. So, I want to leave you with this one critical question to consider about the future of reef survival. Can we effectively manage this invisible layer to save our reefs? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep your eyes open, especially for the things you can't even see.